They had everything. A dream home, 3 beautiful kids, a life most families only dream about. Then one Tuesday night, a routine inspection changed everything forever. What engineers discovered beneath their floors wasn't just shocking. It was the kind of discovery that makes you question everything you thought you knew about safety, privacy, and the people watching you sleep. This is the story they tried to keep quiet. And it's far darker than anyone expected. They're gone. Britain's most beloved royal couple has officially left their Windsor home, and the reason why will genuinely unsettle you. Not because it's scandalous in the way royal stories usually are. There's no feud, no leaked email, no awkward public moment. It's unsettling because it's the kind of thing that makes you look at your own house differently at night. The story begins with a routine structural inspection at a modest royal cottage on the Windsor estate, a property the Prince and Princess of Wales had chosen specifically to give their children something closer to a normal childhood. Engineers were conducting a standard assessment of the foundation, the kind of thing that happens regularly with historic buildings. What they found beneath that house changed everything in about 17 minutes. Beneath that quiet, charming cottage sat a network of underground passages predating the current structure by centuries, some of it dating back to the English Civil War. These tunnels had been completely forgotten, not just by the family, but by every official record, every security sweep, every survey conducted on the property for decades. And that's where it gets deeply unsettling, because it wasn't just the tunnels themselves that triggered the alarm. It was what was inside them. Before we get into the details, if you're new here, we cover royal stories the way they actually happened, not the way headlines want you to think they happened. Hit subscribe so you don't miss updates as this situation develops. Here's the full timeline. It's roughly 1:45 on a Tuesday in late November. The Prince and Princess had gone to bed about 3 hours earlier. Their 3 children, ages 6, 9, and 11, were all asleep. Then the infrared sensors embedded in the cottage walls picked up movement where there absolutely should not have been any. The prince woke up first, which tracks with his military background. Years of training had programmed him to respond to the slightest disturbance. The subtle change in air pressure as security personnel began moving through the lower corridors was enough to pull him from sleep. The princess woke up almost immediately after, the way mothers in crisis situations always do. Neither of them spoke. They've learned over years of public life that in moments of potential danger, listening tells you more than questions ever will. The knock on their bedroom door was soft but insistent, the kind of knock that carries urgency without creating panic. The prince crossed the room in 4 strides and opened the door to find their head of personal protection standing in the dim hallway, his expression communicating everything before a single word was spoken. Behind him, 3 additional officers held positions that made it absolutely clear this was not a drill. What the security chief told them transformed a quiet Tuesday evening assessment into a full emergency evacuation. Beneath the cottage, in spaces that hadn't been accessed or mapped in living memory, investigators had found clear evidence of recent and repeated human activity. Not from 50 years ago. Recent. Tools with no rust. Footprints in dust that hadn't yet settled. Empty water bottles with purchase dates from the previous month. A folding chair, suspiciously clean. A thermal blanket. And most disturbing of all, photographs. Recent surveillance pictures of the family going about their daily routines, taken from angles that suggested the photographer had intimate knowledge of their schedules, their movements, their patterns. Someone had been underneath that house while the family slept above, and not just once. This was a sustained operation. The princess was already moving toward the children's rooms before the security chief had finished his briefing. That detail sticks with you. She didn't wait for the full explanation. She didn't ask for clarification. The moment she understood her children's safety was in question, she was already in motion. The children needed to be woken gently, dressed quickly, and moved to a secure location while investigators determined the full scope of what was happening beneath their home. And the princess, who has spent years cultivating an image of composed, serene capability, had that composure cracked just enough in that hallway to reveal the fierce protectiveness that drives every decision she makes as a mother. The prince stood in the hallway watching her silhouette move from bed to bed, her voice a low murmur of reassurance as she explained to 3 confused children that they were going on an unexpected adventure in the middle of the night. Their eldest, at 11 years old, was already beginning to understand that royal life came with complications other families never face. Their middle child, sharp and deeply observant, asked the question that cut through every carefully constructed explanation. "Are we safe here, Mommy?" The princess's pause lasted only a fraction of a second, but it was long enough for the prince to see the weight of responsibility settle more firmly onto her shoulders. The evacuation moved with the practiced efficiency of a security team that trains constantly for scenarios they hope will never materialize. Their youngest, still foggy with sleep, was carried down the staircase. The princess guided the older children with a hand on each shoulder. 3 vehicles waited in the drive, engines running, routes already plotted and communicated to the broader security network. As the family crossed the threshold into the November cold, the princess turned for one last look at the home they had so deliberately chosen. That cottage had represented a choice. They had moved there specifically to give their children gardens to explore, rooms that felt like theirs rather than museum exhibits, a version of childhood that prioritized space and freedom over the fortress-like security of their London palace. Now it stood behind them in the darkness, its warm windows and familiar corners transformed into something uncertain. The prince's hand found hers. The motorcade pulled away at precisely 43 minutes past midnight, leaving behind a property already being transformed into a crime scene, an archaeological site, and a security nightmare requiring explanations to the king, the government, and eventually, in some carefully managed form, to the public. By dawn the next morning, white forensic tents had appeared across the grounds, each marking an entrance point to the underground network. A detective chief inspector specializing in historical property crimes had been pulled from her bed at midnight, called in for her expertise and the security clearance that allows work within the peculiar constraints of royal investigations. What she found beneath Windsor's carefully manicured lawns challenged everything anyone thought they understood about the security of Britain's most prominent royal residence. The main tunnel system extended far beyond what initial surveys had suggested. Using ground-penetrating radar and thermal imaging, a team traced passages connecting the cottage not only to Windsor Castle itself, but to 4 other properties on the estate, including properties used by other senior royals. The implications are staggering when you stop to think about them. For years, potentially decades, there had existed a network of access points bypassing every modern security measure, every checkpoint, every carefully calibrated system designed to keep the royal family safe. And nobody knew it was there. But the tunnels themselves, while alarming, were historical features that could be secured once fully mapped. What transformed this from an infrastructure problem into a genuine security crisis was the evidence of recent and repeated access. In one chamber located directly beneath where the youngest child's bedroom sat 20 feet above, investigators found a small camp. Inside were those surveillance photographs, not ancient historical images, but recent pictures capturing the family going about their daily lives. School drop-off times. The princess's morning runs through the estate. The hours when security presence was at its lowest due to shift changes. This wasn't casual observation. This was methodical. The prince received hourly updates throughout that first day. Each briefing added new layers to an increasingly disturbing picture. He and the princess had moved the children to a secure location at their London palace, and the cruel irony was not lost on either of them. They had left that palace specifically to give their children more freedom and more normalcy. Now they sat in the very apartments they had tried to move away from, explaining to 3 pairs of questioning eyes why they couldn't go home. The investigation moved with the urgency that royal security demands, but also with the caution that historical significance requires. Every item in the tunnels had to be documented and analysed not only for security implications, but for potential historical value. An expert in Tudor and Stuart-era architecture from the Royal Collection found herself working alongside counter-terrorism specialists. Her knowledge of how these passages could have remained hidden from modern surveys suddenly critical. By mid-afternoon, a partial picture had emerged. The tunnel network predated the cottage itself, dating to at least the 1600s, possibly earlier. Some passages showed evidence of use during the Second World War, when the castle had been fortified against potential German invasion, and the royal children of that generation had sheltered there throughout the Blitz. But somewhere in the decade since, knowledge of the full extent of these tunnels had been lost, surviving perhaps in fragmentary documents that had been misfiled, ignored, or simply forgotten in the vast archives of royal properties. The question haunting every investigator, every security officer, every official who received briefings throughout that long day was exactly the same question the princess had asked in the darkened hallway. Who had rediscovered these tunnels? And what did they intend? The king received his briefing at his London residence. His reaction, while carefully controlled in front of staff, was conveyed with crystal clarity in the phone call he made to his son shortly thereafter. The king has lived through decades of security scares, intruders in bedrooms, suspicious packages, credible threats requiring constant vigilance. But this felt different, more insidious, because it represented a failure not of walls or gates, but of the very ground beneath their feet. By evening, the investigation had expanded to include domestic intelligence services, whose counterintelligence expertise provided resources beyond what even the most sophisticated royal protection team could muster. Agents began the painstaking process of reviewing 6 months of security footage, looking for patterns, faces appearing too frequently, vehicles lingering too long in areas with sight lines to the cottage. A digital forensics unit began analyzing the recovered photographs, extracting metadata, identifying the equipment used, building a profile of someone who had invested significant time and resources into watching this family. The princess spent that day attempting to maintain normality for the children. But the eldest son's questions had become increasingly pointed as the day wore on. He understood enough about security protocols to know this was not a routine evacuation, not a simple maintenance issue that would be resolved with a few repairs and a return home by week's end. The prince found his eldest standing at a window overlooking the palace gardens, young shoulders squared in a posture that reminded his father painfully of himself at that age, already learning that being part of this family meant living with threats other children never had to contemplate. The conversation between father and son was brief but honest, calibrated to provide truth without inducing fear, to acknowledge reality without overwhelming a child still finding his footing in a life he had not chosen. The prince had promised himself years ago that he would not replicate the emotional distance of his own upbringing, that his children would always know they could come to him with questions and fears. Now that commitment was being tested in the most painful possible way. As night fell over London, the investigation at Windsor continued under portable lighting that cast strange shadows across the formerly peaceful grounds. The work would go on through the night and into the days that followed, each hour revealing new complications, new questions, new reasons why returning home was not a decision that could be made quickly or lightly. The morning briefing on day 3 brought revelations that shifted the investigation from security concern into something touching on questions of historical obsession and deeply troubling psychology. Among the items recovered from the tunnels were documents carefully preserved in waterproof containers, suggesting the person accessing these spaces had been engaged in research that went far beyond simple surveillance. Maps from different eras had been marked with annotations, cross-references, and theories that spoke to someone pursuing a quest blending history with dangerous fantasy. A historian specializing in royal properties and their secret architecture was brought in to examine the documents. What he found disturbed him in ways that academic study rarely achieves. The maps and notes suggested that someone had become obsessed with the idea of treasures allegedly concealed by royals during times of political upheaval, specifically the English Civil War period, during which gold and jewels may have been hidden in tunnels beneath Windsor to prevent them from falling into parliamentary hands. This was not scholarly research. This was the work of someone whose historical interests had curdled into obsession. Someone willing to violate every boundary of law and safety to pursue theories that existed only in the darker corners of internet forums and conspiracy literature. The prince sat across from the detective chief inspector as she walked him through the emerging profile. The intruder, for that was now the clear designation, appeared to be someone with extensive knowledge of historical texts, access to resources allowing the acquisition of ground-penetrating radar equipment, and the patience to conduct surveillance and underground exploration over an extended period. But perhaps most disturbing was the evidence suggesting this had been going on far longer than the dates on the water bottles indicated. Deeper in the tunnel system, in chambers requiring an adult to crawl through spaces barely wide enough to pass, investigators found older camps. Items dating back nearly 2 years. Journals filled with observations written in a cramped hand that became increasingly difficult to decipher, as though the writer had been descending into a mental state that matched the physical descent into the earth beneath Windsor. The princess's response to each new briefing was the controlled fury of a mother whose primary instinct to protect her children had been violated in the most invasive way imaginable. She had long accepted the loss of privacy that came with her role, the cameras following her every public appearance, the commentary on everything from her clothing choices to her parenting decisions. But this was fundamentally different. This was someone who had been underneath their home while her children slept above. Someone who had watched, waited, and planned while they had believed themselves safe. The decision about whether they could ever truly return to the cottage now involved considerations extending far beyond securing tunnel entrances. Every room would need to be swept for surveillance equipment. The entire property would require security upgrades that would effectively transform their home into something much closer to a fortress. And the very quality that had made the cottage attractive in the first place, its relative modesty and accessibility, had become its fatal flaw in an age where threats can come from beneath the ground as easily as from beyond the gates. The king convened a meeting bringing together security chiefs, government officials, and senior members of the royal household. The conversation was frank in a way that royal meetings rarely achieve, driven by the recognition that this incident had exposed vulnerabilities extending far beyond a single property. If tunnels beneath Windsor had been forgotten and exploited, what other historical features of royal estates might represent similar risks? Medieval foundations, Tudor-era passages, centuries of architectural secrets that might not appear in any modern survey. The discussion turned to public disclosure, an issue that always complicates royal security matters. The press had already begun noticing that the family had not been seen at the cottage for several days, that routines had been disrupted, that something unusual was occurring at Windsor. Managing the narrative would require careful consideration of how much truth could be shared without compromising the ongoing investigation or providing a roadmap for others with similar obsessions. The prince and princess sat together that evening, the children finally asleep after a day spent trying to maintain educational routines under decidedly abnormal circumstances. The conversation between them touched on questions they had been avoiding, considerations about whether their desire to give their children a more grounded upbringing had inadvertently exposed them to risks that tighter security at more traditional royal residences might have prevented. There was no blame in the discussion, only shared recognition that every decision about how to raise a family in their position comes with trade-offs that sometimes reveal themselves in deeply painful ways. Investigators had identified a suspect by this point, though the individual had not yet been located. Security footage analysis had revealed a pattern. A single man, estimated to be in his late 40s, observed near the cottage with sufficient frequency to warrant deeper investigation. His vehicle had been tracked to a rented property 3 miles from Windsor. But when officers arrived to question him, they found the cottage abandoned in haste, with evidence suggesting he had somehow learned that his underground access had been discovered and that he needed to disappear quickly. The manhunt that followed involved resources typically reserved for counter-terrorism operations. This individual had demonstrated knowledge of royal properties, access to surveillance equipment, and a willingness to spend years in pursuit of whatever goal had driven him into those tunnels. Whether that goal was theft, some form of confrontation, or something else entirely remained unclear. But the uncertainty itself was threatening enough to demand the full attention of law enforcement and intelligence agencies. The breakthrough in identifying him came not from forensic evidence or surveillance footage, but from a source that highlighted how thoroughly the internet has transformed the landscape of dangerous obsession. A moderator of an online forum dedicated to royal history flagged a series of increasingly concerning posts. The user, posting under the name Windsor Truth Seeker, had been sharing detailed theories about hidden treasures beneath royal properties, complete with maps bearing a striking resemblance to the annotated documents found in the tunnels. A psychologist specializing in obsessive behaviors and parasocial relationships with public figures was brought in to analyze the digital footprint. What she found painted a portrait of someone whose interest in royal history had metastasized into something far more troubling. The posts showed a progression, from academic curiosity to conspiracy thinking to personal grievance, with the writer eventually expressing belief that he had been chosen to uncover truths the royal family was deliberately hiding from the British public. The language revealed someone who had constructed an entire narrative in which he was the righteous protagonist of a historical drama, justified in his intrusions because he was serving a higher purpose. His real identity emerged through painstaking digital investigation. A former museum curator at a minor historical society, dismissed 3 years earlier for behavior that colleagues described as increasingly erratic and obsessive. After his termination, he had apparently devoted himself full-time to researching royal properties, using his still considerable expertise in historical architecture and archival research to pursue theories that existed nowhere except in his increasingly isolated mind. What made this individual particularly concerning was the combination of genuine expertise with severely deteriorating judgment. He knew how to read historical documents. He knew how to interpret architectural plans. He knew how to conduct archival research without drawing attention. But somewhere in his isolated pursuit, he had crossed from scholarship into delusion. convincing himself that the royal family was somehow blocking his access to historical discoveries that would restore his reputation and prove that his dismissal from the museum had been unjust persecution. The journals found in the deepest parts of the tunnel system, when finally transcribed and analyzed, revealed a mind that had been spending increasing stretches of time underground, sometimes 8 to 10 hours at a stretch. He had written about feeling more comfortable in the tunnels than in the world above, about how the darkness and silence allowed him to think clearly, about how close he felt to the history he was uncovering. The entries about the royal family began as simple observations, but evolved into something more troubling: parasocial relationships with people he had only ever observed from a distance, or through the lens of his camera. The prince received the psychological assessment with grim recognition that this was a threat that could not be resolved simply by improving physical security. The suspect remained at large, his current location unknown despite a nationwide alert. The profile suggested he would not simply abandon his obsession because his access had been discovered. Someone who had invested years in pursuit of his theories, who had violated every boundary of law and privacy, had constructed an entire identity around his underground explorations. That person was not going to walk away and return to a normal life. The princess found herself dealing with questions from her eldest that she struggled to answer honestly while still maintaining his sense of security. He had overheard enough fragments of adult conversation to understand that someone had been watching their family, that this person had been underneath their home, and that he remained unaccounted for. The conversation she eventually had with him was one of the most difficult of her years as a mother, balancing the need to acknowledge real danger with the equally important need to prevent fear from consuming his childhood. The security upgrades at the cottage proceeded week by week. Tunnel entrances were not simply sealed, they were retrofitted with sensors to detect any attempted access. The grounds received additional surveillance cameras, facial recognition systems, and monitoring equipment that would make future intrusions significantly more difficult. But each improvement, as necessary as it was, represented another step away from the simplicity that had made the cottage so appealing in the first place. Meanwhile, the investigation expanded to examine whether the suspect had been working alone or was part of a broader network of obsessives sharing information and potentially coordinating activities. The online forums where he had been active revealed a subculture most people never encounter, a digital underground where conspiracy theories about the royal family flourish, and where individuals encourage each other toward increasingly boundary-violating behavior in pursuit of truths that exist only in their shared delusions. The psychological toll on the family manifested in ways both obvious and subtle. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure you're subscribed to UK Dispatch so you never miss a story like this one.